Today is Saturday, November 13th. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Earlier today I posted a talk on what parents need to do after they have chosen to pull a child out of a modern school or out of modern schooling. And in this talk, I'd like to take some more time to explain a bigger problem that relates to that issue but extends to everyone. It has an effect in all of our lives. And the topic is how modern education destroys all education. How modern education destroys all education. For most students, well, I shouldn't say students, for most people, they went to school in a modern school setting, whether it was a public school, a private school, it doesn't matter because they all do the same thing. They went to schools that taught a watered-down, bare minimum, modern curriculum. They were not taught by masters of any craft or any art. They were taught by school employees, many of whom are barely competent, many of whom or most of whom have no actual professional achievement in the fields that they taught. Many of them were average students themselves and became full-time teachers as a way to make a paycheck. And we've been taught by people like that in modern schools. And this is true whether you're in a public school, a private Catholic school, private non-Catholic school. Teaching is a profession that very few real masters of any art or craft get involved in as far as schools are concerned. If a person is a real master, they'll likely start their own school or have enough interest and financial support for private instruction that they would prefer to do that rather than go, quote-unquote, find a job working for a school. I remember when I was working in Charlotte, the school we were at was an expensive private school in Charlotte. Many of the children in the school, many of my students, their parents were CEOs and executives in some of America's biggest corporations, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, with central offices in Charlotte. These kids lived in homes where their fathers were leaders in national or even global business, fathers making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, driving, directing, and leading modern industries and markets. And their kids were attending schools where the guy teaching the economics class was barely able to pay his mortgage. And he'd be arguing with kids who knew more about banking from sitting at the dinner table at home than this teacher could ever know. And that's the experience in modern schools. The people teaching are not the experts. And we have this dilemma, not only in practical subjects like industrial arts or computing or economics, not only in practical courses, but also in the liberal arts, literature and writing, public speaking, mathematics, history, religion, and so on. The people teaching in schools are not the experts. And we have to wonder, what exactly are they even teaching? We don't even know what they're teaching. Most of them just administer the content of a published textbook or teacher's manual, and they try to add as little to it as possible to avoid having to answer any questions. Students learn to write from teachers who have never successfully written themselves, who aren't published authors, who've never written a book, have no following of readers who enjoy their writing. They're just writing teachers. And what this does to us as students is confuse us. This confuses us. We're in school and we're taught to write. The rules that we're taught are not real rules of writing. They're artificial rules. They're not sufficient to actually help us write. And then we're assigned a writing assignment. We complete the writing assignment. We turn it in. And the teacher judges our writing assignment, gives us a grade. And we often have no idea what we really did right or wrong, or what we would need to do to get an A. Some kids are good at it, some kids are not good at it. Nobody has any clue what the teacher is really looking for. The teacher pretends that this is all some kind of systematic program, but no one has any idea what the rules or standards actually are. The students who get good grades can't explain to you why they get good grades. The students who get bad grades have no idea what they would need to do to get a better grade. And we start to hear this language. Sharon is a good writer. Michael is a good writer. I'm not a good writer. She's not a good writer. He's a good writer. We talk with this language as if every skill is a matter of some kind of natural ability, some innate talent that separates students in different subjects. And it's as if the school's job is to identify and reward those who are naturally talented in a certain subject and penalize those who are not naturally talented in that same subject. But the bigger problem is that we don't even really know if we're being judged according to talent, because what we do is being judged by some random teacher. And we don't even know if his or her opinion would agree with the opinion of a real master. And so this whole perception of learning is confused by the modern school. There's no concept of arts being taught. There's no objectivity. Students don't really know what to do or what not to do. And what happens is students end up saying that they like courses that they happen to be good in, and they just don't like courses that they get bad grades in. For me, for example, when I was in high school, I had no idea what the algebra teacher was talking about. I had no idea what the chemistry teacher was talking about. But I could turn around and get straight A's in geometry and physics. I could get straight A's in Spanish and barely pass English. I just had no idea what the expectations were. In some courses I happened to do well, in other courses I happened to do poorly. And that's how I viewed school as a kid growing up through high school. Just good at some things, not good at other things. Your grades are what they are. And that's life. Now, fortunately for me, when I was 18 years old, I went through a pretty radical conversion experience through a number of events in my life. And there was a clear break for me between my life as a child and my life as a Christian adult. There was a crystal clear, black and white division in my life into two different lives. And thankfully, because I didn't study very well as a kid, I didn't have much in my head. Most of what I knew in my mind that sort of formed my character was what I had learned through sports. I played smart positions in the smart sports. I played baseball and I was a pitcher and a catcher. I learned a lot about the mental side of the game. I learned a lot about the mental competition. And that's what I actually loved about sports, was all of the mental stress and having to overcome great challenges by a lot of mental self-coaching and discipline, self-control, patience, doing things that are counterintuitive, living by lessons learned from experience. All of these sorts of mental lessons I learned through sports. That was my character formation as a kid. I didn't learn much from school. Even if they would have taught me bad stuff, I wasn't paying attention. I was saved by my lack of study. I was taught to work hard, growing up in a blue-collar family, surrounded by men who were working. But that was about it. Work and beat your opponent. That was the philosophy of my life. But when I went through my Christian conversion, it became very clear to me that studies were essential to my salvation. It was crucial for me to know certain subjects and to have certain skills in order to save myself from false ideas and bad habits and confusion. And study became my sport. All of the energy, all of the zeal, all of the competitiveness, all of the self-sacrifice that I had devoted to sports, I invested in my studies. And I pursued my studies with the same intensity that I used to pursue sports with. And I think it was the obsessive competitiveness of my life in sports that easily translated into a productive life of studies. But studies for me wasn't some kind of leisure or social activity. It was an intense personal contest. It was me against everyone. Me against my professors, me against my classmates, and I wanted to win. I wanted to win everything. And as I studied as a Christian, I learned about the scriptures and started reading the scriptures very intensely. And I started to see what weaknesses I had that kept me from being able to read and understand the scriptures. And I knew that this was essential to my spiritual life. So I started to pursue the knowledge of those subjects and the cultivation of those skills that I knew were necessary for my Christian life. I would read the scripture and not know about geography or history. I wouldn't know what the scriptures are talking about. And so I knew that I had to study history. So I studied classics in ancient history. I would study writings of church fathers and other early Christian writings, and I would not know what they're talking about because they'd make references to philosophy or to Greek and Roman culture, and I didn't know what they were talking about. So I studied classical mythology. I studied the classical languages so that I could read and understand the scriptures. And as I dug into all of these historical resources, I started finding all kinds of study resources. I started learning about education in the past and what Christian schools were like in the Middle Ages, in the early church, in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. And I started gathering all of these digital resources from throughout Christian history. And as I began studying them, I started to see how orderly and clear the teaching was in these old books, and how things that I had heard about in school that didn't make any sense were so clearly explained and taught in these old Christian books. And I realized that these old books were actually the master texts. And so I started to study how to speak, how to write, how to study. All of these things, all of these skills, I started to study from ancient sources. And I developed a working knowledge of the classical liberal arts and of classical philosophy, and my studies led me eventually into Catholicism as far as theology is concerned. My experience in studies was extraordinarily rare, and I understand that. I understand that the whole experience I had in college and after college was extraordinary. But there's something that I've noticed that reveals just how profound the harm done by modern schools really is. And that's what this talk is intended to address. I hope that I can articulate it well, because if I do, I think it can set a lot of people free from some obstacles that are standing in their way and preventing them from moving forward intellectually and in other areas of life as well. As I said, because I never studied and didn't pay attention in school as a kid, I didn't have a lot of modern stuff stuck in my head to get in the way when I did start to study rightly. When I learned subjects as a Christian, I had the opportunity to take up the studies as if it were for the first time. And I think many people don't have that opportunity because there's so much modern stuff in their heads from school. And here's what happens. That confusing, discouraging, restricting educational experience that people have in a modern school that leaves them thinking that they can't do this and they can't do that and they don't understand this and this is confusing, this doesn't make any sense, I'm not a good writer, I'm not good at chemistry. That attitude, which now is multiplied to infinity as we've allowed scientists and physicians to start actually diagnosing troubles in modern schools as natural disorders, as crazy as that is. And I've talked about that in another talk, but we've gone to the point where the school has to be treated as if it's unquestionable and immovable. The school is treated as if it's an ancient mountain that society has been built around from the beginning of the world. And we judge ourselves based on how we relate to the mountain without asking if the mountain is even real, or if the mountain should be in the center of our society, if we even need to pay attention to the mountain. The school institution cannot be questioned, cannot be examined, cannot be criticized. It is taken for granted and is treated as so essential to life that if you don't function successfully in the school, you will actually be labeled as having a disability or a disorder, as if there's something physically, naturally wrong with you because you don't work well in the school arrangement. That's how the modern society thinks. The school is so real that your health is judged based on how you perform in the school. It's crazy, but it's true. And even Christians walk around repeating these memorized lines, talking about, oh, my son has blah, 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 and my daughter has, H413 symptomatic disorder. All of this crazy talk is just passed around, listened to, repeated all through society, even Christian society. And as far as school is concerned, we've just lost our minds. This public school system was invented in the 1850s by men who were not even Christians. And now we use this school model as a test of our human perfection. It's crazy. But that's how modern society works. And what happens is this. People think back to their school days. And you have the kids who were nerds in school who got good grades. And they think that because they got good grades, they were smart. They think that their good grades in 9th grade English class were proof to the universe that they are wise men. And they walk around in life imagining that they're smart because they managed to get into a high school honors class when they were attending the public school. And then you have kids who didn't perform well in that modern school system for any number of reasons. And they have allowed themselves to be convinced that they're actually dumb and don't understand what's going on, don't understand different subjects, can't read, can't write, aren't good at math, on and on and on. And they take these grades from high school. They take these teachers' opinions from middle school, comments made by teachers in elementary school, and they wear them on their chest for the rest of their life, talking about these things as if they're real. Now, everybody thinks back to school and they think how hard it was to get a good grade. They think that they had to really study hard to get an A in their history class. They had to really work hard to finish that research paper to get a B in English. And they think back to their modern studies in modern schools and they say, man, I had to work hard just to get my diploma. I had to work hard to get my degree. I had to work really hard to do this or do that. I remember going to school early in the morning. I remember carrying all my books home in my backpack. I remember sitting at the table and doing homework. I remember being so scared about the test and getting my grade, and when report cards would come out, I remember being so nervous. I had to work so hard to get good grades, and they imagine that that's what's required to cover the basics of a public school education. Then what happens is someone like me comes along and says, the public school standards are so low that they're not even human. It's not even human education. The standards are so low compared to what people studied in ancient Greece and Rome and in the Middle Ages throughout Europe, even in early America. The standards are so low. We need to raise the standards and restore a truly human education. When modern people hear that, they think to themselves and say, oh my goodness, I can't even imagine how hard it must be to pursue higher studies, to pursue more rigorous studies. I can't even imagine how much more one would need to read or one would need to work and study, how much more stressful it would be, how much more confusing it would be to pursue one of these lofty, ancient, philosophical educations. I can't even imagine it because I could barely do well in modern schools. And so what people think is that by raising the standards and restoring classical goals in education, that you would need to take the work that's done in a modern school and multiply it by 4. That the writing lessons would be 10 times more confusing. That the history lessons would be twice as impossible to understand. That you would submit writing assignments with even more uncertainty about what the teacher would think, because the standards are more mysterious, more unknowable. And this is why modern people, I believe, aren't even willing to consider classical education, because they imagine that if they can barely get through modern education, they have no chance of success in a classical education. Those people must have just been way more gifted than we are. And that's how they think. They take their modern school experience and they imagine a program multiple times more difficult than the modern education was. And they rightly conclude that it's impossible. There's no way they can do that. If their assumptions are right, that the classical curriculum is simply the modern curriculum multiplied a number of times, they would be right. There's no way that they can do it. But they're wrong. They're wrong about the classical curriculum. Let me give an illustration to try to make this clear. Imagine if there was a giant pile of rocks, bigger than a house. A giant pile of rocks. And imagine that you were told that this pile of rocks had to be moved. But you were made to wear a blindfold, and you were given a cup that had a hole in it to move the stones one cup load at a time, blindfolded with a faulty tool to help you. And imagine that you got working, and you worked, and you worked, and you would work for hours and be told that you didn't even move any stones because you couldn't understand that the stones were falling out of the cup. You couldn't see anything. And you just kept working and working and working. And you would just continually hear these negative messages about how, well, that was pretty good. You moved a bunch that time. This was a good hour. That was a good trip. You did good this day. You didn't do good this day. And you couldn't tell what was causing them to say that you did well on one day and poorly on another day. You felt like you were doing what they told you to do. You felt like you were moving rocks, but the feedback seemed random and confusing. And let's say you worked on this for years and years, for 12, 15 years. You worked to move these stones, and then all of a sudden one day, they took the blindfold off you and let you look, and you saw that you had barely moved any stones at all, and there were stones spilled all over the place. But let's say you didn't even get to see the cup you were using and never knew why that was so hard. Something that seemed simple. And then imagine a man comes along and he says, "You're wasting your time on these little stone piles, doing nothing." And he points across the field and there's a giant mountain of stones. And he says, "That's the stone mountain that we need to move. Not this little house-sized pile, but that mountain-sized pile." And so you look at this mountain-sized pile and you say, "Oh my goodness, if I worked for 12 years and barely moved a piece of this smaller pile, there's no way I can move that pile." And you would say, "There's no way I can do that." And you would make that judgment based on your experience, blindfolded, working on the other pile with crummy tools. You would disqualify yourself because of your experience without thinking about why your experience was the way it was. You would disqualify yourself by thinking about your experience, but not thinking about why it was unsuccessful. And you wouldn't even let the man finish speaking before you disqualified yourself, excused yourself, and told him to go away because it was hard enough for you to get anything done with this little pile of stones. And off he went. And that's that. You decided you couldn't do it based on your past experience, blindfolded with a cup that had a hole in it. And yet you hear stories about men who had moved the mountain-sized pile, and you can't even imagine how they could have done that. And so you're left to conclude, well, they must be amazingly gifted men. But I'm not good at moving stones. So I'll stay here with all the blindfolded people with holes in their cups, and we'll just keep working on this pile. Because this is what we understand. This is what we have experience with. This is what we can do. And you stay there. However, if that man came to you to talk to you about the mountain-sized pile of stones, and instead of just excusing yourself and disqualifying yourself, you would reasonably ask the man and say, how could it be possible? If we struggle to move this little pile of stones, how could it be possible that we could move that mountain of stones? If you would just ask that question, just ask how would we do that? You would find that the answer actually makes it easy. You would say, oh, well, over there, before the mountain, we have all of this different equipment. We have these giant bulldozers and backhoes and dump trucks. And instead of telling you to move stones, like you do here at this stupid mountain, instead of just telling everybody to move stones with no equipment, no resources, no direction, no understanding of what's even going on, we don't do it like that. What we do over there is we teach you first how to use all of this equipment. We teach you how to drive a dump truck. We teach you how to use a bulldozer. We teach you how to drive a backhoe. And once you learn how to use these powerful tools, then you start moving stones. And once you learn to use those tools, moving the stones is actually very easy. That's actually not even the hard part of the job. The hard part of the job is learning to use the equipment. Once the equipment is mastered, moving the stones is easy. And you can easily move a whole mountain in just a couple of years. But you would not have allowed yourself to hear the explanation of how, because you based your judgment on the appearance of the mountain and your experience working with a smaller pile of stones, with a blindfold on, with faulty equipment, or no equipment at all. And this is how parents and students think when we talk about classical Catholic education. We talk about how much more there is to study. We talk about how much more there is to learn, how much richer the content is than this silly little collection of 5 subjects: English, math, science, foreign language, and social studies. We talk about the classical Catholic curriculum, and it looks like a mountain reaching up into the clouds compared to this little pile of stones in the public school curriculum. And if instead of disqualifying yourself and excusing yourself based on your own faulty experience, if you would ask, how do we do this? You would quickly learn that the problem with the stone hill that you're working on is not that there's something wrong with you, not that there's something good about someone else who does better than you, not that you have some kind of disability because you can't move the stones efficiently, or because you can't move the stones like the people working on the giant mountain did. What you should do is stop and ask, how can I be told to move that mountain when in my own educational experience I wasn't able to move this little pile of rocks? I barely moved anything at all. If you would ask, how am I supposed to do that? You would find that it's nothing like what you think it is. It's nothing like what you think it is. And this is how modern education destroys all education. Modern education leads people to think that there's only one way to learn, one way to study, one curriculum to be studied. And if you're not good at it, it's because you have problems. And your job, if you have children, is to just try to help them succeed in the modern curriculum better than you did, with the same confusion, the same ineffectiveness, the same vexations, and just try a little harder. And the results are the same. Generation after generation, the results are the same. And everyone, Christians included, which is most amazing to me, Christians included, have accepted this discouragement, have accepted this futility and confusion and self-doubt and resolution to simply acknowledge their natural talents and stay in their lane as the way that life actually works, as reality. And so even the Christians walk around with the language of this modern system in their mouths as if it's something that they learned from the Catechism of the Catholic Church or from sacred scripture, and not something made up by modern men that's completely arbitrary and optional for everyone. It's amazing to see how Christians have allowed this to happen. As if the learning that identified Christian schools all through history is simply impossible today. Impossible. Because we all have learning disorders. None of us can pay attention. We're all visual learners. Do you ever hear anybody say, oh, modern education led me to realize that I was a great text learner, that I had great memory? Do you ever hear any of this modern educational talk be positive? You ever wonder why it's always negative? It's always that someone is disordered or that there's a problem. We never hear anyone saying, modern education led me to realize that I have an amazing ability to process textual information, to memorize it and use it in real life. You ever hear anybody say that? Why is it always some kind of criticism of our nature? Always some acknowledgement of impossibility. I'll tell you what it is. If you've ever watched The Lord of the Rings, you'll remember when Theoden, who was a king, and I don't know all the details of this too much. Most of what I know of Lord of the Rings is stuff that I heard from the other room while my kids watched it and talked about it. But King Theoden was a decrepit old man sitting on a throne in a kingdom that had completely fallen apart, as his younger heirs stood around wondering what the heck was going on. There were plenty of men. The children of the king were noble and virtuous, and yet this king sat in his throne looking like he was 3 times as old as he was, weak, barely alive, feeble. And what we learn in the story is that the king's condition and the condition of his entire kingdom, which was on the verge of collapse, was all owed to the deceitful counsel of Wormtongue. And if you know the story, you'll remember Wormtongue. Wormtongue was constantly in the king's ear, telling him how weak he was, how much stronger the enemy was, that all of these normal measures taken by a responsible king would not work, that the only thing he could do is just be patient and wait. And he ignored all the counsel of his friends and allies and sat there constantly soaking in the counsel of this lying spirit. And finally, in the story, Gandalf comes to this king, breaks into the throne room, drives Wormtongue away, and commands Theoden to rise up and take up his throne and lead his people, because war is imminent. And just like that, as soon as Wormtongue is chased away, Theoden, in the movie, you'll remember if you've seen it, all of a sudden, his youthful appearance returns. He's no longer an old, half-dead, decrepit man. He's a young, strong king. And he rallies his people together and leads them to war. This modern system has reduced Christians to the condition of that old, decrepit king who just sits around talking about all of his disabilities and weaknesses, all of the things he can't do. Christianity is in a state today like Theoden and his kingdom was in Lord of the Rings. It's a kingdom that has been persuaded that it's stupid, obsolete, impotent, has no hope, can't possibly be successful, needs to conform, cannot resist evil, as it sits there just soaking in this false counsel. If we read the scriptures, we read events like the wars of the Maccabees, where the Maccabees argue that with God, the size of an army is irrelevant. We say things like, with God, all things are possible. And Christians walk around and they say these things in certain areas of their lives, but in other areas, especially education, they have been trained to confess that there's nothing they can do. There's no improvement that they can make. There's no solution to the problem. They're just not good at learning. They're not good in school. They can't study anything. They can't pursue higher learning. They just have to accept whatever everyone else is doing. They have to just try to fit in and be like everyone else. They have been completely deluded into this lazy stupor by this modern educational culture. And when they look at that mountain and think of moving it, that mountain of classical Christian learning, they can't even comprehend how that could be possible. And they go so far as to say that it's not even realistic. They just deny that it was ever even done, because they try to imagine doing it within the framework of the modern school system. They try to imagine not merely writing some cheesy 5-paragraph essay assigned by the teacher, but imagine writing speeches and all different kinds of rhetorical forms and poetry. And they say, oh, I couldn't even write a research paper. I couldn't even get a good grade on an essay. There's no way I could possibly study rhetoric. I couldn't even pass Algebra 1. There's no way I could study classical arithmetic or geometry. I'm not good at math. And they've been trained to go around with this dumb, lazy spirit, imagining that a classical education would be pursued in the way of a modern education and with the tools of the modern education that they experienced. And so they've allowed themselves to be completely turned off to classical learning because they see it as something that's just the stuff of ancient legends. Like they must have been miracle workers back then. You know, they must have walked on water, turned water into wine, and also studied rhetoric. The classical liberal arts must have been like miracles that they did back then. They were all miraculous. No, this was the normal education. This was the education before Christianity even showed up. This was the normal education before the Holy Spirit was even given to men. This was normal education in Greece and Rome and ancient Egypt and Babylon. This dumb education is a completely new invention. And by allowing it to define us, allowing it to tell us what we're good at and what we're not good at, allowing it to judge us and grade us and label us, we've disqualified ourselves and excused ourselves from those studies that were normal for 5,000-6,000 years. And this is how modern education not only destroys its students presently, but destroys all education and destroys its students throughout life. Students have no interest in taking up studies as adults. They can't wait to finish. They just want to get their diploma or get their degree and never see a book again. If they do read, they may collect some Christian books and just flip through books and read easy literature, easy things like that. But they won't even undertake the study of Plato's dialogues or Euclid's Elements of Geometry or Aristotle's philosophical texts or St. Thomas's writings. They imagine that those writings are for wizards to study. And this is how modern education destroys all education. It creates in those who it affects, it creates in them a sense of disability, of incapacity, of weakness, of hopelessness, of stupidity, as if they have some kind of natural disability or defect that leads them to not even try to learn or study anything virtuous and noble, anything beautiful and beyond what's required for a paycheck. They won't even try it because they've been persuaded, like Theoden, that they're just dumb. And they need to just leave that for other people. And they sit and they stand in awe of modern scholars who know practically nothing. This is what Socrates demonstrated in his dialogues. Not that they would know, but Socrates demonstrated that fake learning leads to specialization. All of these specialists pretending that they're brilliant men. And Socrates regularly made fools of the specialists and showed that they know nothing. They don't even understand the purposes of their specializations. That those kinds of studies, specialization for the sake of money making, is not even real learning. And yet the modern Christians sit with their jaws dropped, looking at men's list of artificial academic credentials, which within a Christian intellectual life are useful, but without a Christian intellectual life are useless. How many men do you know driving business and technology today who have PhDs? How many of the world's great innovators, inventors, business leaders, how many of them obtained a PhD first and then, through the benefits of that PhD, went and accomplished great things? How many do you know who follow that pattern? That's not how it works. In fact, that's not how college works, because college, what they do even from the beginning is try to find the kids who are going to be the next generation's leaders without the college, who are already successful, to bring them to the college so that the college can benefit from their influence far more than they will benefit from the college's influence. And that's why when you look at the men driving society, you find that colleges fawn over them. they're not the ones fawning over colleges. But the dum-dums who have been persuaded that this fake learning is real, they stand around oohing and aahing over men with advanced degrees who are barely employed, who are complaining and protesting about how poorly they're compensated and how poor their working conditions are. They're constantly complaining about the life of college professors, which is all that they do. They simply gobble up all of these academic degrees so that they can turn around and just work in that academic environment, and they spend their whole life complaining. Because there's nothing desirable about it. They're not the men leading society. And Christians, unlike the business leaders, are mesmerized by this fake academic world. Elon Musk doesn't care about universities and their degrees. Jeff Bezos doesn't care about universities and their degrees. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs didn't care about universities and their degrees. Google doesn't care about universities and degrees. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't care about anyone's degrees or what college they went to. They could care less. It's the Christians that have been duped into thinking that this artificial academic world is real. And that Christians, with the authority of the church, the doctors of the church, the writings of the saints, all of the great works of the philosophers which harmonize with Catholic teaching, are useless. And the Christians allow themselves to be completely disarmed by the secular world. Leave all of that stuff at the door and come on in. And here comes the dopey Christian walking in after agreeing to leave all of his glory outside and to stand naked like a fool in the presence of these men who can't hold a candle to the writings and wisdom of the church and her doctors. That's what's wrong with modern Christianity. It's a timid, cowardly, feeble, deluded generation that's ashamed of its own history and tradition. It agrees to strip itself of all of its wealth and equipment and advantages, all of its resources, all of its strengths, all of its weapons. It agrees to leave them all outside and then enter into debate with people who have none of those resources, but have been able to persuade the Christians to be ashamed of them and abandon them outside. This is how modern education destroys all education, and most of all Christian education. If you were to look at a modern Christian school and say, Christian people, what are you doing? What are you studying? What are you teaching? No one would even be able to explain what they were doing or why. They're simply never asked. And they never ask themselves. They never ask, what am I doing? Why am I not teaching what St. Thomas Aquinas taught? Why am I not teaching what the sacred scriptures teach? Why is the language that comes out of my mouth so different than the language I read in the catechism, or in the scriptures, or in the writings of the church fathers? Why does my life, my intellectual life, seem to have nothing to do with the wise men and saints that I claim to be in communion with? Nobody asks. They just stand there marveling at the public school, boasting that they've been approved by the accreditation agency and can be trusted now because they have secular accreditation. Now that they've dumped all of the traditional subjects out of the curriculum, now that they've reduced Christian education to mere public school diploma pursuits, now that they've reduced Christian education to workbook exercises, they've finally qualified for that accreditation which says they're just like the public schools. That's what we're celebrating. Parents literally look to see if the Christian program is recognized as being like the public school and accredited by the same agencies. That's what they want to know. They don't want to know, does this program actually teach what the saints taught? Does this program actually teach what sacred scripture teaches? Does this program actually teach what the catechism teaches? No one asks that. I've never received a call from someone asking for me to prove that the content of our curriculum was the same as that studied by saints and wise men in history. No one has ever asked me for proof of that. I get asked, is your program accredited? And that when I ask the parent, what does that even mean? The parents admit they have no idea what that actually means. And yet there they are, with all the modern language in their mouth, no idea what they're even talking about. Not asking the question they should be asking. Is this what the saints and wise men studied and tell us to study? That's the question Christians should answer. And Christians should be confident that not only should they study what the saints and wise men studied, but that they can study what the saints and wise men study. And they should ask, how? How do we study this? How do we go about learning this? How can we possibly learn all this when we can barely learn the modern curriculum? And there are answers to those questions. The classical liberal arts teach us how to learn first. And then we take those tools, those bulldozers and dump trucks and backhoes, and we go to work on the information of a classical Catholic education. So, that's how modern education and modern schools destroy all education. I hope that you are able to think outside of that box. I hope that you're able to receive what I tell you, and that you're encouraged by it, and that you're willing to look and see not what everyone else is studying, which is irrelevant, but what the saints and wise men studied, and ask the question, how can we study that? Because you'll be surprised that your struggles in learning have not necessarily been owed to your disabilities or stupidity, but because the system itself that you studied in, the curriculum that you studied, is the problem. But you've allowed worm tongue to tell you how stupid and weak you are, and you fell for it. And you walk around talking about how dumb you are and seeking out the lowest standards because you feel that that's where you belong, because after all, your 9th grade English teacher told you you weren't a good writer. And you could never figure out that 7th grade algebra stuff. Therefore, you must be dumb. And you should stick with the lowest standards. You've allowed yourself to be duped. You've allowed yourself to be disarmed. You've allowed yourself to be talked out of your inheritance. You fell for it. And now you're either going to continue in that way, or you're going to be like Theoden and snap out of that delusion and do what you should do as a Christian. I hope that's helpful. God bless.